All right, it's tier list o'clock. So basically, there's a release candidate on the beta patch, and with there being a release candidate on the beta patch, that means that that specs are no longer going to get like massive tuning passes on a weekly basis. Instead, we're going to see tuning passes largely based off of hotfixes and just on a per spec or per class basis. And I think that now is probably a decent time to do a tier list talking about the DPS and M+ and how they're faring versus one another. I will say right now, I think that the DPS is actually pretty decent. A lot of specs do competitive AoE, then their level of competitive single target is kind of on a gradient versus one another. I feel like the hero talents in some instances have upped some of these specializations, stock relative to how they have been performing in the past. Obviously, some specs have gotten a rework and some things are changing. Obviously, no comp lives forever, as unfortunate as God Comp and Shadow Priest players might be, but no comp lives forever. I will say that I think that the tuning is kind of relatively okay right now. I think that it's like there are some specs that are good, and there's actually a decent amount of specs that are good, and then there are some specs that are really fucking bad, and it does happen. I will say I'm gonna start by moving around these tiers to give it something that's a little bit more indicative of like where we're currently standing. So I'm gonna put this as A-, and I'm gonna put this as B, and then I'm gonna put a B- below this. So I'm just trying to separate them out because there is like a very distinct amount of tiers that we're going to be having with some of these specializations, and so I am going to try to separate them. But I will say again, just look at how narrow this is. Sometimes we'll have like a few specs in like D tier and whatnot every single tier, and so noticing that we don't have any of those in that tier, it probably bodes well for the expansion just as a whole. While we do have 2 A's and 2 B's, let's try to quantify like what these tiers actually mean. S is probably a specialization that will be seen in every, if not almost every single composition. These are the specs that are typically metagame dominant, where you're going to be seeing a listing in LFG and being like, we have to have that. A and A- are typically these specs that are really good second or third DPS options. They do a lot of damage. Sometimes there might be a little bit of a drawback, especially compared to some of the S tier specializations, or there might be a slight drawback compared to the A versus the A-. That is a little bit of a difference that we're going to see between this tier, but these are really good second or third DPS options a lot of the time, and specs that you're not upset about having or bringing into your DPS composition. B and B-, I think that B is like a spec that you're like good to fill out with your third DPS option, and then B- is something that's maybe a little bit worse than that. C is a spec that I think that you're going to rarely see in like top metagame compositions. Maybe you see it if somebody's like really sick at it or wants to play it, but it's not something that's going to be like metagame dominant. Again, these are typically looking at like high keys, and so whenever you're looking at like an average weekly key, some of these specs might not be as good. Take example Aug Evoker, which I'm going to rank this in S tier already. Aug Evoker is metagame dominant at a high level. I don't think it's necessarily metagame dominant like a low level or even like a low title range level. The amount of damage that they provide is actually quite good as it currently stands, especially with things like Scale Commander. But both Scale Commander and Infernal Warden are quite nice. Obviously, the big advantage of the Aug Evoker is the survivability and the defensive gain. Ebon Might and Blistering Scales on your tank and your healer allow your group to be able to do, a key level higher, and that's just really valuable for high-end keys, and that's why you're going to see them be metagame dominant at like a high level. I don't necessarily think that they're like super fantastic at like a medium to low level. The other S tier spec right now is Destruction Warlock. So Destro recently got like a massive buff on the beta, and I was even hesitant about making this tier list because of the current state of Destro, right? Like if you go and look, Blizzard just recently hotfix tuned Destro Warlock. Destro Warlock is and was Rain of Firing on single target. They're doing some of the top single target DPS while just bashing their AoE spender. A lot of it comes down to the fact that they're generating a lot of soul shards, and just functionally how the spec is designed currently is very weird. They also did a lot of buffs to them, and so I kind of expect this spec to get changed, especially since it's on Blizzard's radar. How far they're likely to fall is up for debate. But as it currently stands, they're an S tier specialization. If the expansion launched today, it would be Aug Evoker and Destro Warlock, and pretty much every single composition you have to be running that. You might even run double Destro Warlock if the expansion launched today and with an Aug Evoker. Okay, other top tier DPS. Let's look at the A tier. There's no other S tier DPS. Frost DK recently getting a couple of buffs. On top of that, they were getting buffs to some of their hero trees. A lot of their damage came from like Rite of the Apocalypse before, but Rite of the Apocalypse is getting nerfed, and then Frost DK ended up getting buffed. Frost DK is a very solid spec, and if you watch streamers like Wallpin or whatever, this is one of the highest DPS output specs in the game. Defensively, DK has probably been, in Raid, the best non-cheat death spec in the game. In Mythic Plus, you know, AMS, especially now that they have like group AMS that can go on some friendly party members, they have anti-magic zone. They have a lot more HP with Veteran of the Third War than anybody else. They can Death Strike heal themselves more than a healer honestly can even heal them. And so I think that Frost Death Knight is quite strong. A lot of it comes down to their DPS. You can just list off utility as reasons that the spec is strong, but ultimately at the end of the day, it comes down to DPS, and this is one of the highest DPS specs in the game. Another one is Frost Mage. Oh my god, who could have possibly foreseen a Mage spec being good? They recently buffed Frost. It's expected to see one of the Mage specs in here. I think that Frost is probably the best of the Mage specializations at post buffs. I think they're playing a no GS build, which is a bit weird. But in general, I think that Frost's damage, especially with Lance and especially with like the orb damage and whatnot, is quite high. Of course, you're also a mage, so you're bringing a bunch of defensive value with things like Mass Barrier. People would get mad if I didn't mention Arcane Intellect because they believe that Arcane Intellect is more than 5% intellect. But you know, raid buffs are nice in that regard. But I think the biggest issue, or the biggest thing for mage, is obviously survivability gain. Does a lot of damage. I'm gonna put. I think Unholy's worse than Frost DK. I'm going to put Unholy DK in A anyways. Unholy DK does a lot of AoE damage, especially a lot of burst AoE damage. Now, you're not pulling super large on some of these trash packs, so I would think like the first pull in Necrotic Wake is like an Unholy DK's like dream pull, where that's like a 20 or 30 mob pull, where an Unholy DK would actually be able to surpass something like a Frost Death Knight in terms of the damage that they're able to output. But like I think in general, like the Unholy DK and the Frost DK, both of them are just quite strong. Unholy DK has recently gotten a couple nerfs with some of the Rider of the Apocalypse stuff. I don't think that they got any direct nerfs, but with the Rider of the Apoc nerfs, and I think they got a little bit of tuning down. But they were still one of the best specs in the game, and I suspect that they're going to still stay that way. All right, let's start filling out A-, and then I'll kind of talk about these as we go. I think this is good. This is good. This is good. Let's talk about these specs. Aff Warlock. Good AoE, bad single target. Really good AoE, actually, bad single target. The major drawback of Aff, it was kind of the same thing in Dragonflight, where the amount of AoE damage and sustained AoE that it was doing was quite strong. I do think that it's maybe a bit problematic that it's a little bit worse than Destruction, so you would be unlikely to see them at the expansion launch today, but I don't think that in isolation they're very bad. On top of that, I'll put Demo here. I think that Demo is actually quite good. Demo's single target is fairly solid, and with some of the buffs that it got recently with things like Diabolist and some of their hero trees, Warlock had some of the worst statistical hero trees in terms of like value, and all of those ended up getting a couple of buffs. I think the downside of Demo is that it's not super bursty, so it looks a little bit worse than some of the 10s that you'll be doing whenever things can die instantly. But I think it's fairly solid. I think that's pretty good. Arcane Mage, this was the king for a lot of beta. It received, I think, 3 consecutive weeks worth of nerfs, with also hitting their hero talent tree. Arcane is still quite strong, and I think that it's one of the specs where you could realistically put Arcane up here with Frost. I think that Frost does a little bit more damage, which is why I'm tending to lean towards Frost being the A tier mage spec. I just don't love putting both mage specs in like a high tier. I do think that Arcane is high tier viable, and I think that there is a lot of value in the burst that it provides. Additionally, you know, I think that just like how honestly all 3 mage specs do their damage, where they're bursting on a single target and they like spread that to some of the AoE, it is valuable. Now, not all of them are fire mage adjacent in terms of how they function just as a specialization, but I think that the overall output of Arcane is fairly solid. Sin and then Sub, I think, are both A- specs. There's been a lot of complaints about rogues in general, but a lot of those complaints are aimed at mechanical issues about how rogues function. Damage-wise, both Sin and Sub are quite competitive. Sub was looking like it was going to be just A- island for the rogue specs for a little bit, but then Assassination got a fairly steep buff to both. I think it was Trickster and just a 10% aura buff, to the point where you'll watch people like Casual Addict or whatever on beta do a considerable amount of damage, and I think that, you know, now Sen has a lot more value in that regard. Obviously, they bring things like Shroud, they have a very good defensive toolkit and whatnot, and I think the defensiveness is something that is important to talk about with some of the specializations that we're going to be looking at, because defensive value is still such a dominant rhetoric, I guess, coming into War Within Season 1, kind of like we were talking about like in the beginning of Dragonflight, where being able to live all of these keys is going to be like a pretty big deal. And so having these specs that are very sturdy versus large amounts of damage is important, and obviously Rogue is going to end up being that. But I think the bigger thing, again, the damage is like quite good, and just like how they're doing damage is fairly valuable. Arms Warrior, I have them in B-. So Arms Warrior is not awful. I think it's a little bit behind Fury. So I'm gonna find Fury and put them in A-. And I think that Arms is a little bit behind Fury in terms of like just the stuff that they're bringing. And I think that just in terms of like the damage that they're providing, I think it's just like a step behind it, and so it's going to end up going into B-. I don't think it's very likely that you're going to see them in larger and wider spread compositions. Fury's also ends up being easier and burstier, and so I think it's like a spec that people are going to tend to play a lot more than Arms. So now I think that both of these specializations are playing Slayer, from my understanding. But I think that Arms in general has a surprisingly high amounts of sustained cleave compared to what they normally have. Normally they're like gated behind sweeping strikes and stuff like that. But they actually have fairly solid priority damage, fairly solid sustained cleave. But I think that they're just a little bit of a step behind in terms of damage. Whereas Fury, on the other hand, obviously, you know, the spec's been... You know, the damage profile the spec provides for a very long time has always been about the same. They also do a lot of self-sustain with like Bloodthirst healing, and they also have just like a very strong defensive toolkit just as a whole, with being able to do things like D-Stance and just having more HP than other classes because of their weapons and shit like that. So, I mean, it's just like obviously going to be pretty valuable in that regard. Balance Druid, probably the spec that I feel the most comfortable talking about in terms of like theory crafting and whatnot. I'm going to probably put it in C. I think that the AoE damage that the Balance Druid does is like, it's like fine. It's not great, but it's like fine. The single target is fucking trash. Like, you are actually battling a tank, and it's kind of similar to like a Shadow Priest. So I'm gonna put both of these in C tier together. And whenever I say this about Balance Druid, I'm also saying this about Shadow Priest. Okay, AoE. Again, like I was saying earlier, I don't think really any spec is like fucking awful at AoE. Some of these specs are really, really, really bad at single target, and Moonkin and Shadow Priest are that. I think that Shadow Priest is designed very well for M+ with how they deal damage. Things like Psychic Link and just like how their apparitions function and how they do AoE just in general, where they're hitting a single mob and they have their dots on all the other mobs and then they do damage to all those other mobs. I think that Shadow Priest in terms of design is pretty problematic, but in terms of tuning as it currently stands, it's pretty bad. I think that both Shadow Priest and Balance Druid are maybe likely to get buffs due to raid damage, because if you look at how they're going to be performing in terms of like what we saw during raid testing, I think that both of these specs are very behind the mark on single target damage from raid testing. So I think that both of these are you have a decent chance of getting buffed, I think, if you're playing either of these specs, which is interesting. Beastmastery Hunter got a pretty big nerf this week. Was it the best Hunter spec? Not doing the most amount of AoE. Was actually very, very good at single target, which is why I think it got nerfed this week. It was looking to be a fairly solid raid specialization just in general. And in terms of an M+ specialization, I think that it got a lot. You know, it wasn't great, and then it couldn't necessarily afford a bunch of nerfs for M+, and so now I think it's probably in C tier with some of these other specs. Again, C tier, not historically a terrible ranking to see. It's not like great, but it's still playable. Like C tier I would describe as like playable, but you're not going to see in like in terms of broader meta compositions. Other C tier spec, we got Fire Mage. Pretty bad damage. They got nerfed a bunch of times in a row. They just I like completely removed Living Bomb from this most recent patch. All of their damage was in Lit Fuse and Living Bomb recently, but now it's been just completely shot. So I think that this is a spec that is now in C. Elemental Shaman, if I made this tier list a week ago, they would probably have been in A. Now they're going to be in B. 22% damage nerf on the most recent passive tuning. They were fairly solid. The raid buff is quite good. Some of the things that they were bringing was nice. I love a short interrupt on a caster. That's always phenomenal. However, at the end of the day, a lot of the issues come down to damage and survivability and enhancement, or Elemental Shaman, you know, with 22% nerf. couldn't necessarily afford a 22% nerf. Maybe they come up with a new build that's not slinging meatballs all the time, but as it currently stands, it seems a little bit behind the mark. Again, B is not bad. I think that they're definitely a viable third DPS option. They're able to survive a lot better this expansion with things such as, like, you know, Rock Ellie is a lot more integral part of their defensive kit. I think that they just have better opportunities to be able to live this expansion than they did in Dragonflight, but just not top tier. Like, that's just it. Enhancement Shaman, A minus. I think that they're good. I think that there's a chance that I could put them in B. I believe that they're going to be A minus. So they got a few consecutive nerfs. I will say that I think that this is one of the least represented specs in the game. A lot of the Enhancement Shaman damage, particularly for M+, comes down to the Stormbringer hero talent tree, which has been nerfed in 2 consecutive passes. Tempest and the uncapped damage that the Stormbringer tree provides to the Enhancement Shaman is quite strong. They also have some of the best fun on the game. Definitely one of the better specs, just in general. I'm gonna put Havoc Demon Hunter up here. Kind of similar to Rogue. Havoc Demon Hunter's been complaining a lot. A lot of that is due to mechanical and hero talent and, like, thematic reasons that they've been complaining. They've also not got much attention. Fact of the matter is, their damage is fine. They're not great. Like, they're not the top tier DPS, right? They're not a DK, but their damage is fine. They're played like the Eldrachi hero talent, which they end up basically doing their full single target rotation and doing maximum cleave while doing their full single target rotation. Their rotation doesn't change very much. Now, specs in M+ that give up basically no single target to do full AoE are typically specs that are quite good, because then those specs will be balanced around raid and then be able to perform at a decent level in M+. And Havoc Demon Hunter is one of the specs where they give up basically nothing to be able to do full AoE. And that's always a valuable resource. Dev Evoker, I've seen it a couple of times. Kess was saying that he didn't think that Dev Evoker was very good either. A lot of it comes down to, I think, their AoE tuning. They're playing a Firestorm build in M+, which is a little bit different than what they have been playing in the past. You know, they can be good. Again, a lot of it comes down to the fact that their AoE damage and sustained AoE damage is just, like, not great. Their single target damage has seen better days. Like, they were really good at some points. Whenever Dev Evoker was, like, borderline A tier, maybe like top of B, there was a couple times that happened in Dragonflight. There was actually one time that they were even A tier. That came down to the fact that they did a shit ton of single target and did a shit ton of AoE. And those are the situations where we need to see where Dev can actually, like, rise up the list, is if they start doing a shit ton of damage. As it currently stands, maybe a little bit undertuned relative to some of the other specializations that you can possibly bring. Windwalker Monk. Kind of similar vein with, like, Arms Warrior, where it's like, you know, it's like, okay, it's not, like, great. Can do a decent amount of AoE, but it's, again, not phenomenal. Also kind of a weird spot where I don't know if I necessarily expect it to get buffed in any capacity, but it's, like, okay. Yeah. All right, Ret Paladin, also similar. You got these melee DPS here, where Ret Paladin recently got some buffs to Divine Storm, but straight across the boards nerfs to their single target. I don't know anybody who was like, wow, you know what's actually good single target? Ret Paladin. Holy shit, you know, we need a Ret Paladin. Not exactly the greatest specialization, but getting a little bit of AoE buffs while getting some single target nerfs is interesting. They also, I think, over the course of the beta, have nerfed some of the more interesting parts about Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin was doing a lot of priority damage to a single mob and then actually being able to, like, do decent cleave off of that. Now they're going back to this Divine Storm AoE or single target thing, and I think that it's just, like, really hard for a specialization like a Ret Paladin to be a meta spec whenever you're having to make such large decisions as to, am I doing full single target or am I doing full AoE? The best specializations are able to do both with very little penalty. Feral Druid is a spec that I probably memed on in the thumbnail here, but it's not that bad. I'm gonna put it in B. I think the damage that I've seen from it is fairly solid. I watched Macene play a little bit. I've seen Medius play a couple of times, and their damage is more or less fine. They actually do okay single target, and they do okay AoE. I don't think it's not as good as, like, some of this other A tier stuff. But there's a world where you can be a third DPS option while being, you know, fairly solid. Also, it looks like not very many of the Druid specs are looking great. Resto Druid a little bit behind the curve in terms of HPS throughput. I'm not, like, ranking healers or anything, but Resto Druid a little bit behind the curve, at least in people's perception, in terms of HPS throughput. Balance Druid obviously not phenomenal. Guardian looks pretty good, but say you're not playing with the Guardian Druid, you could actually get Feral for Mark of the Wild. Mark of the Wild is one of the more valuable raid buffs for M+, because it provides both offensive and defensive benefit. And so I think this is a specialization that B tier is fairly solid for them, and they're doing like okay things. MM, whenever for a while Sentinel was like a fucking beast mode hero talent tree, and then MM got nerfed heavily, and it's kind of been trying to recover ever since. It's not like that phenomenal, but it's not bad. The amount of AoE damage that it does is fairly solid. Unfortunately, it still falls in the issue of, you know, being target capped, but in general, you're pulling lower target amounts this expansion than you have been in the past. There's very few Algathar Academy Azure Vault style dungeons where you're pulling 20 plus mobs all the time. And so, you know, that can kind of lend itself to being okay for the MM Hunter. I think MM Hunter's like damage is more or less fine. I will say a downside is like it doesn't really do jack shit for the rest of your group. They did get a little bit more utility this expansion than they had in the past, where Hunter just as a general class, terrible utility suite, probably the worst utility suite in the game. I still suspect that they probably had the worst utility suite in the game, maybe them and Warriors. But I think that the reason that they're fundamentally going to be B is because I think their damage is a little bit lacking. And that leads me with one of the last couple of DPS specs. Surv Hunter, dude, I'm just bouncing around, honestly. Their damage is good. They were actually better for a few patches. They do actually a decent amount of AoE, especially with like Wildfire Bomb Cleave, and just how they're doing their damage is fairly solid. Their single target's also quite good. And I think that Surv, kind of similar to Enhancement Shaman. I suspect these to be underplayed but good. Especially good for second or third DPS options. Like if you're playing one, if you're already playing one, it's fairly solid. I can see a world where you're like, oh, Tettles, you should probably move Surv and Enhancement down to B. They're only going to be third DPS option viable. And you know what, I could actually see that, but I'm just going to leave them in A-. I think that this is a tier list that I'm going to have to revisit like right before the expansion comes out as well. And I think as it currently stands, I think that my read on both of these specs is that they're good, not the best, but still fairly solid. Last spec, Outlaw Rogue. This spec is some hot ass. It got a 10% aura buff and it's still hot ass. Maybe you could argue it's B-. I think this is shit as C. This is a spec that always is problematic because how they do their damage with Blade Flurry and whatnot is very, very valuable to just how M+ just functions as a whole. But whenever they don't have like the damage throughput, particularly on single target and particularly on like AoE, that's going to become problematic. They're still target capped and whatnot, so it's not like they don't have like massive changes. People also stay bitching about the rogue hero talent, so that's not something that's phenomenal either. But overall, that's how I've ranked all of the DPS specializations. Again, I think that there's actually going to be a decent amount of class changes coming into the expansion. I don't think that we're going to be seeing like large weekly blue posts anymore because I think we're on release candidates, but instead I think we're going to be seeing week-to-week hot fixes to some of these specializations. I suspect that this Destro Warlock is going to get moved down at some point. There might be some more moving to some of this mid-tier stuff, but in general, this is kind of where I'm ranking a lot of the DPS as it currently stands today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Goodbye.